Okay, so let's turn then to the book of Job, and it's part of the wisdom and poetic literature in the Bible. We have many people who think that the New Testament equivalent of the book of Job is the book of James. So in Job then, we're going to come across poetry, and we're going also to be following conversations. We need to look at the structure of the book, and it's a very clear structure. There are 5 sections to the book of Job. So if we just flick our way through them then, the first 2 chapters set the scene and lay out the context for the book as a whole. And these 2 chapters are very well known. They have a repeated pattern. We're introduced to Job in the first 5 verses. And then you have these scenes. You have a scene in heaven, followed by a scene on earth. Then you have a second scene in heaven, followed by a second scene on earth. And that's the deliberate structure to this introduction. In the scene in heaven, chapter 1, verses 8 down through to 12, you have this royal court. God is upon his throne. The sons of God come before him, amongst whom is Satan. It's very much described in terms of royalty and courtesans and the nobles, if you like, coming into the presence of the king. And we have God drawing attention to Satan, asking Satan, where does he come from? And then we have the introduction of Job. God introduces Job to Satan. And we have the challenge there, if you like. Look at verse 9 of chapter 1. Does Job fear God for nothing? So we have the scene in heaven, followed by then, in chapter 1, verses 13 to 22, you have the corresponding working out on earth of what has taken place in heaven. And Job loses his property and he loses his children. Tragedy strikes Job. And the tragedy then is the outworking of the exchange between God and Satan that we saw in the very first scene. That's chapter 1. And then you have a repetition of that in chapter 2. We have a heavenly scene, again, the same formula of God's conversation with Satan. God grants permission then to Satan to affect Job's health. And the scene on earth in chapter 2 is when Job's health now is being affected. He's lost his children, he's lost his property, and now his health, finally. And the chapter, it ends with the arrival of Job's 3 friends. So if you look at verses 11 down to 13, these 3 friends who are going to be so important come to visit Job in his distress, and they sit with him for 7 days. That's the setting of the scene in the book of Job. That's the first section. Then you have this huge section that consists of a cycle of conversations. So from chapter 3, and this extends all the way then through to chapter 31. So if we just flick through, you can see that this conversation goes round and round between Job and his 3 friends. His 3 friends are Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And you have, as I say, cycles of conversation. So we have Job in chapter 3, expresses his distress. Then one friend will speak, then Job will reply, then another friend will speak, and Job will reply, and so on. And this is a detailed conversation that we are privy to. It takes the form of poetry in the book as such. And Job lays out his distress in chapter 3 with a series of why statements. So if we take a look at chapter 3 then, you see the first of the why statements in verse 11. Now, this is not why me, why am I the one suffering? Instead, Job is reflecting on the nature of human experience. Verse 11 of chapter 3, why did I not die at birth. There's your first of the why statements. Why do we live? Why is life like it is? Why is life so filled with distress and difficulty? And then verse 20 is the second of the why statements. Why is life given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter of soul? And this why is more to do with why do we continue to live? So the first is why live. The second is why do we continue to live when it's just so awful? And then the third of the why statements is in verse 23. Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden and whom God has hedged in? And this then takes up the question of the relationship between the one who is suffering and God. Why does the person who's suffering continue to have this relationship with God when God has boxed him in, when God seems to be indifferent, God seems to be deaf to the cries and the distress of the one who suffers? So there's Job laying out his case. And then what we find is the friends take it in turns to offer to Job their wisdom. And their wisdom takes the form of what is known as retributional theology. It's the idea that God is punishing Job for his sins. Suffering, says the friends, is punishment. Suffering is what you get and what you deserve when you have sinned and when you have not acknowledged your sin before God. You're living with unconfessed sin and you're not as righteous as you think. Job has been introduced as righteous to us in the first chapter, but the friends take issue with that in their conversation. So if you take a look at chapter 4 and verse 7, and you see there, remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or were the upright ever cut off, even as I have seen those who plough iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. Now, there's a very classic statement of this whole notion of punishment, retribution, divine justice, God's anger and wrath upon us because of our sin. Suffering is how God repays us when we have sinned. Now, this is a view that's going to be worked out in these chapters. It's a view that Job is going to refute. Job will not allow for a second that he has sinned. And Job stands against this idea that our sufferings in life are a consequence of God's punishment. God is just and dealing justly with us for our sins. So we'll take just a look at some of Job's replies then to his friends. Take chapter 9. And if you look at verse 21 of chapter 9, Job says, I am blameless, yet I do not know myself. I despise my life. It is all one thing. Therefore I say, he destroys the blameless and the wicked. Job is now arguing that God is this arbitrary figure who punishes the good and the bad, the just and the unjust. Everybody has the same treatment from God. And as you follow these conversations that Job has with his friends, Job becomes very determined to find fault with God. Job, in fact, reaches the point where he wants to put God in the dock and he wants to put God on trial. He wants to accuse God of unfairness, injustice. He wants to say that God is arbitrary, God is just indifferent to human experience. And the idea of a court, a legal court now rather than a royal court, is developed throughout these chapters. And Job will say again and again and again that he wishes to put God on charge. He's going to question God himself. God's going to be in the dock. And Job will prove in court. He wants his day in court where he will prove that God is at fault and that God is wrong. And that's how the conversation develops over these chapters. And we've got some very famous chapters and some very famous verses. What I'd like you to look at is chapter 28, because chapter 28 gives us the key to the book of Job as a whole. So if you take a look at chapter 28, Job begins to reflect on the subject of wisdom. And he says that wisdom is hard to find. And these are wonderful verses. He's comparing mining and the subject of wisdom. And he says, look, you know where to mine silver, and we know where to mine gold, and we know where to mine jewelry and, sapphires and so on. But where can we mine wisdom? Where is wisdom to be found? And look at these verses. They're amazing verses. Verse 12 of chapter 28. But where can wisdom be found? Where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its value, nor is it found in the land of the living. The mines say, it's not in me, and the seas reply, it's not in me. It cannot be purchased for gold, nor can silver be weighed for its price. It cannot be valued in the gold of Ophir, its precious onyx or sapphire. Neither gold nor crystal can equal it, and so on. So, verse 20, where then does wisdom come from? And where is the place of understanding? It is hidden from the eyes of all living, and concealed from the birds of the air. Destruction and death say, we have heard a report about it with our ears. It is God who understands its way, and he knows its place. And then the chapter ends very famously, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. Now, here's the key to the book. Many people will say, what's the book of Job about? And the obvious response, but the wrong response, is to say the book of Job is about suffering. The book of Job is not about suffering. The book of Job is about wisdom. And suffering is the subject about wisdom reflects. Suffering is the hook, if you like, the content that wisdom seeks to engage with. So the book of Job is undoubtedly, as laid out here in chapter 28, a book about wisdom. Where is wisdom to be found? And who is wise? Now, of course, we've been introduced to Job, and we were told that he was a wise man. So is wisdom to be found in Job and in what Job has to say? That he is innocent, that he wishes to put God in the dock, that he wants his day in court, and he will prove to God that God is unfair. Is that where wisdom is found? Is wisdom found in Job's three friends? Because they were introduced to us as wise people, the wisest people of their generation. So is wisdom to be found in the idea that suffering is punishment for our sins? And over the years, I've certainly known people who will say to me that they are suffering because God is punishing them. They've done something wrong. They've not been good enough Christians. And so the suffering that they're experiencing, if it's physical health suffering or relationship suffering, is the punishment of God. Now, is that where wisdom is to be found? Well, there's the theme of the book. What is wisdom? Who is wise? Where is wisdom to be found? And of course, the great clue in chapter 8 that we'll discover at the end of the book is verse 23. Job 28 and verse 23. God understands its way, and God knows its place. So there's the great section then, the cycle of conversations in which these wise people discuss the issue of suffering. Then you get the third section of the book. And the third section of the book is known as the Elihu narrative. And this young man who's been there all the while, but we haven't noticed. He's silent throughout the conversation between Job and his three friends because he's a young man, and he recognizes the wisdom that is meant to be found in the elderly. Wisdom comes with age, is the idea. So Elihu has sat quietly through all of this, listening to the conversation of those who are older than him, wiser than him, better than him, until in the end, Elihu can't stay silent any longer, and he has to speak. So if you look at chapter 32, right the way through to chapter 37, you have the Elihu narrative. And Elihu is going to put a different view forward, that suffering isn't punishment for sin, that suffering is something else. So let's meet Elihu then in chapter 32. So the three men, that's the three friends, cease answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then the wrath of Elihu, this young man, was aroused because he, this is Job now, he feels, is justifying himself rather than God. And Elihu is also angry with his three friends because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job. Now, because they were years older than he, Elihu had wanted to speak to Job. When Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, his wrath was aroused, and Elihu answered and said, and look at how he introduces himself. Verse 6, I am young in years, and you are very old. Therefore I was afraid, and dared not declare my opinion to you. I said, age should speak, and multitude of years should teach wisdom. But, he says, there is a spirit in man, and the breath of the Almighty gives him understanding. Great men are not always wise, nor do the aged always understand justice. Therefore I say, listen to me, and I will declare my opinion. What Elihu is claiming there by a very extraordinary phrase in verse 8, he's claiming that God has inspired him. God has given him unique understanding into the subject of suffering. And Elihu is very keen to share his understanding now with the others. And it's a great claim that he's got divine wisdom, a spirit from God in him that enables him to give a view on a subject. And if you were to ask, what is Elihu's position then? What does Elihu think? Well, his view is known as the restorative view. So remember now, the three old men had the retribution view, that suffering is punishment. Elihu puts forward the view that suffering restores or refines a person, that suffering does us good, that there is value in suffering, that we are made better because of suffering, that it's like a refiner's fire, that there's something of value to be had when we suffer. It affects our character, it burns away the dross, it makes us better people, better believers in God. Suffering is a form of doing us good. It restores or refines. Now, this view of Elihu is going to be found in the New Testament, and it's going to be found particularly in the experience of Peter. And Peter, in his epistles, will talk about refinement. You'll talk about purifying. You'll talk about the fires of suffering and how suffering burns away the dross. You'll talk about, and I don't know much about it, smelting, working with metals, with iron, and how fire purifies and so on. Now, that's basically what Elihu is saying. Right at the beginning of humanist history, this book is the earliest book in the Bible, set in the very early days of human experience. This is Elihu's view, that suffering refines. Now, you're going to have to think carefully as you read Elihu to try and identify when he says this sort of thing. So if you look at verse 29 and 30 of chapter 33, he's talking about how a man is coming to the grave. A man is coming down to Sheol, and God visits him. And God visits him once and twice and three times. God is visiting him, giving him a second chance, refining him, enabling him, renewing him. That's the idea, okay? So Job 33, 29 and 30. Behold, God works in all these things, twice in fact, three times with a man. He brings his soul from the pit, that he may be enlightened with the light of life. Now, do you see the idea there? A man is in a terrible state. God visits him and he understands. God visits him and enlightens him. God restores him. That's the kind of thinking here. You see the same idea in chapter 34, verses 31 to 33. So Job 34, verses 31 to 33. For has anyone said to God, I have borne chastening, I will offend no more. Teach me what I do not see. Now, can you see there? Suffering is about learning. Suffering is about enlightenment. Suffering is about understanding. You'll understand as a result of suffering what you didn't understand before. You'll grow in your knowledge and you'll grow in your experience. You'll become wiser. Show me. Teach me what I do not see. And if I have done, so, I haven't sinned, but if I have, different to the friends, should he repay it according to your terms? This is the idea then. Suffering is a good thing. Not in itself. Suffering is awful in and of itself, but it's a good thing in what it leads to, because it enables us to grow and to mature. And that's what you see in the Epistle of James. James also will say that suffering is grievous in itself. The trial is not joyful, but what it leads to. And it leads to the peaceable fruits of righteousness. That's the idea. So Elihu is very different to these old guys. He's got a positive view of suffering. The three friends have a negative view of suffering, that suffering is just punishment. Elihu has a positive view, that suffering makes us better, it makes us wiser, and it makes us stronger. Now, as Elihu is giving his wisdom, if you want to say, is it wisdom? Well, Elihu is giving his view, and as he does so, a thunderstorm develops. The skies darken, the wind picks up. You have a sandstorm. They're sitting outside, of course, throughout this entire conversation. And a sandstorm develops, and the skies get dark, and the lightning begins to flash. And as that builds in the background, whilst Elihu brings his conversation to an end, out of that storm, God speaks. And that's where the fourth section of the book begins, chapter 38. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said. And what you have here now are the discourses of God. God himself is going to directly address Job. So God has been the silent listener to this entire conversation. And we'll discover that in the final chapter. God has heard Job's complaint. God has heard Job saying that he wants to put God in the dock. God has heard the three old men, he's heard the young man, and now finally God speaks. And these are the most amazing passages in our Bible. They are full of the majesty and the glory of God. They are full of his power. They are full of the wonders of God as creator. They are full of the relationship between God and creatures, how God commands, how God feeds, how creatures look to God, how they are dependent upon him, how God commands the sun and the rain, he commands the wind and the seas, he commands the hail, he knows the roots of the mountains, God organizes life, God lifts up his voice to the clouds, he sends out lightning. They are just amazing chapters that I'm sure for all of us have been chapters that we've referred back to time and time again, that we have read and been thrilled about and rejoiced in. They are just wonders of chapters. And listen to how God begins in chapter 38. Verse 2. Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now, here's your theme. Wisdom. Where is it? Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Now, straight away, if you're a Christian, you just love that. Because we live in times where everybody wants to question God, where people think they have the right to challenge God, to put, like Job, put God in the dock. They want, they say, to challenge God about who he is and what he does. But of course, all of that is complete nonsense. The message of our Bible is God's going to question us. God will challenge us. Who do we think we are? Where were you, says God in verse 4, when I laid the foundations of the earth? Now, isn't that just outstanding? Tell me if you have the wisdom. Who determined the measurements for the foundation of the earth? Surely you know. Who stretched the line upon it? To what were the foundations of the earth fastened? Who laid its cornerstone? And look at this as a picture for what happened in creation. When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. What a beautiful picture of creation. And of course, what we have here are a series of rhetorical questions. God doesn't expect an answer because there is no answer. Job wasn't there when he laid the foundations of the earth. Job wasn't there when God measured and put its foundations and fastened everything. Job wasn't there. And as you go through the chapters, when he talks about the morning and he talks about the seas and he talks about the light and Job wasn't there. And this is the whole purpose. What we are finding here is the majesty of God being emphasized. And by contrast, our limited lives and our limited understanding and our limited experience. We have so much to say, but yet we know so little. We have an opinion on everything, but we lack wisdom. We've got an abundance of words that flow from our mouths, but we've got very little going on in our minds. And that's what's going on here. And so you get the sense that God is demonstrating his glory and his majesty to Job, and then he takes a breath. And as he takes a breath, Job responds, chapter 40. Behold, I am vile, verse 4. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Job responds, and then God goes again and tells us again about his glory, his majesty. He talks about the behemoth, verse 15 of chapter 40. He talks about the Leviathan in chapter 41 and verse 1. These creatures, these enormous creatures that we can't identify. Who are they? Are they dinosaurs? You know, there's all sorts of speculation around them. But God is simply describing to Job how the greatest things on the surface of the earth, the largest, the most fierce, the most outstanding natural phenomena are nothing compared to God. You know, the wonders of the world that we hear so much about today with the likes of David Attenborough and so on, they are nothing in comparison to the marvel and the wonder and the majesty and the glory and the grandeur of God. It's an argument from the lesser to the greater. The earth, with all its wonders, is less compared to God. God is the greater of them all. And chapter 41 ends with the majesty of God having been established. And Job replies in the opening verses of chapter 42. So those verses, 1 to 6, they end the fourth section, the discourses of God. They end with Job's response. And Job's response is one of worship. He is worshipping the God who has just revealed his majesty to him. If you look at verse 3 of chapter 42, you asked, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Well, Job hasn't got wisdom, has he? Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. So, we're having the answer to our question. Where is wisdom? It's not found in Job. Job has got this reputation for wisdom, and Job acknowledges at the end that he's not wise. He's acknowledging that he knows nothing, that there are things too wonderful, things beyond him, greater than him, things that his mind does not have the capacity to grasp. Job is acknowledging his limitations. Job isn't wise. Wisdom isn't to be found with Job. Well, of course, when you go then into chapter 42 and you have the final section of the book, which you can see isn't poetry now, it's back to prose like we had at the beginning of the book, we find that the three men, either the old men, they do not have wisdom because God rebukes them. God tells them in the closing section of the book that he finds fault with them. Look at verse 7. So it was, after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, that the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is aroused against you and your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. So God is really angry with these three, and it's a very serious thing when you give advice to somebody, and that advice is not an accurate reflection on the nature and the character of God. You've got to be very careful that you don't misrepresent God when you speak about him, especially when you speak about him to those who are suffering. God takes a very dim view if you say the wrong thing to somebody when they are suffering. And what these three friends have to do now is they have to give an offering. They have to offer a sacrifice. And they have to have Job to pray for them. And it's interesting because Job now becomes a kind of priest as he mediates. He speaks up on behalf of these three friends. And just as an aside, the theme of a mediator has run throughout the book of Job, a go-between, somebody who can intercede on behalf of. And during that second section, that long section of conversations that Job had with the three, Job laments the fact there's not a mediator. He can't appoint somebody who will speak to him before God, who will speak up for him before God. Job can't find such a person, like a lawyer or a defense counsel who'll put his argument to God and God will hear him. Job laments that. Well, of course, you're at the end of the book. Job himself is becoming a mediator. He's an intercessor for his three friends. Nothing is said about Elihu. And then you have the conclusion of the book. And from verse 10 down to verse 17, Job is restored. And it's very well known. Verse 10, the Lord restored Job's losses, chapter 42, when he prayed for his friends. Indeed, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Job has children again, he has possessions again, and all I want to do really is show you how he does have twice as much. There's what's known as doubling. So if you go to chapter 1 and verse 3, you get a list of Job's possessions. Chapter 1 and verse 3. His possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household. Now keep your finger there. Go to the very last chapter then. And the very last chapter and verse 12. He had 14,000 sheep, and he had 6,000 camels, and 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000. So you see it's twice as much. he ends up with twice as much at the end of his life. And then he has 7 sons and 3 daughters, so he doesn't end up with twice as many kids. And we have the names of his daughters. Why do you think the daughters are named and not the sons at the end of the book of Job? Okay, one last thing then. It would be very remiss of me not to go to chapter 19 and to look at this chapter. Chapter 19. So Job wants a mediator. He wants somebody to speak up for him, to represent his case. And you get these verses. Now I'm going to leave you with these verses, okay? And we'll think about what they mean. Job 19, verse 21. Have pity on me, my friends, for the hand of God has struck me. Why do you persecute me as God does, and are not satisfied with my flesh? He means by that is, look, you know, things are bad enough for me without you telling me I've sinned. Oh, that my words were written, and that they were inscribed in a book, that they were engraved on a rock with an iron pen and lead forever. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last on the earth. And after my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself. And my eyes shall behold, and not another, and my heart yearns within me. For if you should say, how shall we persecute him? Since the root of the matter is found in me. You know, you're saying I'm the one at fault. Be afraid of the sword for yourselves. For wrath brings the punishment of the sword, that you may know there is a judgment. Now, we know through Handel and Handel's Messiah, those words, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that he shall stand at last on the earth, and after my skin is destroyed, that this I know, that I shall see in my flesh God. Now, what do they mean? What do they mean in the light of the subject of wisdom? And what do those verses mean when Job's great desire is to put God in court, to put God in the dock, and to have somebody speak up for him? The book of Job is a book of wisdom. And of course, the answer to the question in chapter 28, where is wisdom to be found and who is wise? The answer is God. God alone is wise, and wisdom is only found in God. There is very small amounts of wisdom in human beings and in human understanding. But wisdom is found in God, and our search for wisdom begins with the fear of God. And you're going to see this in the Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And Paul will say in writing to Timothy that God alone is wise. He is the immortal, the invisible God. He is the eternal King who alone is wise. So the book, its answer to the question of wisdom is God alone is wise.